crazy lately. And Italian has, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I just said my bad.
No, no worries. But Italian has a tendency to get kind of expensive. And so I wanted to do a dish today that is relatively affordable. There's not a whole lot of ingredients if you saw the ingredients list email that was sent out. And so because of that, one way that we've talked about a lot to elevate your dishes that you make is to focus on high quality ingredients. And so we're truly sticking to like true Italian today, and we'll talk more about those ingredients as we use them. So today's menu item, we're making a kind of pasta called cacio e pepe, which really just translates to cheese and pepper. Cacio is a kind of formaggio, and both of those are synonyms for cheese, and pepe means pepper. So nothing terribly crazy, but where it gets a little complicated is the technique in how to infuse those flavors into your pasta. And so the craziest part is the technique. Ingredients are fairly darn simple, but we'll tackle all of that in today's class. So to pair with that pasta dish, we're also making just a very simple bruschetta. It's little toasts on crostinis, or also called crostinis. So it's kind of like garlic toast in that way, with just, it's almost like a pico de gallo, but Italian. So just chopped tomatoes, some basil, maybe some salt and pepper, and that's it. So it's going to be a simple class in the sense of ingredients, but a little bit complicated when it comes to the pasta part. But we're going to debunk and demystify all of that stuff so that when you go to make this at home, it's going to go, I'm not kidding, like very, very smoothly. So before we get to the technical parts of it, and 75 degrees. And I have my largest pot here and my largest skillet. My largest pot has boiling water. I need to turn it up just a little bit more. And then my largest skillet is preheated to just under medium heat. We're going to toast our peppercorns in just a little bit. But the first thing that we need to do is tend to our pasta. So before we get going, whenever there's like a pasta dish in Italian, you want to think about the kind of noodle you're selecting, because noodles essentially are the vehicles of flavor, and the flavor is often the sauce that's paired with it. So in a classic cacio e pepe, you use some sort of spaghetti noodle, which is a longer noodle like this. And so in the recipe, I sent out two suggestions. One is just to stick with regular old pasta. That's totally fine. But I'm using today a kind of pasta called bucatini. And bucatini looks nearly identical to spaghetti pasta, but it's a little bit different in that it's slightly larger, just by like a millimeter or two. And also it's more like a macaroni noodle, like a really thin one, than a classic spaghetti noodle. And so I'll show you on this, hopefully you can see it okay. Can you see how there is just a little hole? Now it's a little blurry. Can you see that at all on your end, Ruth? Maybe not.
Maybe pull it back a little bit.
Okay. I mean, it's not super important, but basically this is just like a long skinny.
A little bit.
Okay, yeah, it's just a long skinny macaroni noodle. And so one of the reasons that I would, if you do find this, I found one at Whole Foods for like a pound of bucatini noodles for $3, so nothing too crazy. But since there's a hole in it, some of the flavors like the pepper and the cheese and the sauce can get into there. We're also cooking the noodles, we're partially cooking the noodles in the sauce itself. So a lot of there can be more flavor in the noodle than just a traditional spaghetti noodle. So both work, but if you can find bucatini, I promise you the texture and the flavor is really, really good. So in the classic Italian way, we need to start with seasoning our water. We want the water to be salty like the sea. And so the kind of salt we're using today is also important. So I'm going to add in a 1/4 cup of salt. That sounds like a lot of salt. And it is, but we're using coarse salt. And coarse salt is the least salty salt out there. And that's a chunk for, that's true for two reasons. One, if you use something like a table salt, the granules, of course, are like really small. And so there's just more, you can fit more salt into a 1/4 cup than you can with the coarse salt because the sizes and the shapes are irregular and there's more air in here. Also, table salt has a tendency to be iodized. And if you use iodized salt in this, like coarse iodized salt, it's going to make your pasta water and your pasta taste a little bit metallic. So if you can, please avoid it. And you don't have to do a full 4th cup. I would say if you don't like things as salty, you could do 2 tablespoons or 3. There are 4 tablespoons in a 1/4 of a cup. But we're not adding any more salt to this dish. All the saltiness is either going to come from our cheese or essentially the brine that we're making, which is this salty pasta water. So I'm good with this. I'm going to add in this coarse salt. Turn up the heat a little bit more. I'll set that off to the side. I'm going to go ahead and give it a stir quick so that all of that gets dissolved and mixed in thoroughly. Cool. And I'm mostly good with that. So before we add in the pasta, what I want to do is add whole peppercorns. So whole peppercorns here, I'll show you. Just the traditional black peppercorns. There is a kind of pepper in, it's like I forget, I think it starts with a P. I can send it after this class in like a follow-up email. But just whole black peppercorns is going to be just fine. You don't want to use the pre-ground pepper because there's so much more really fantastic aromatic and flavorful oils in whole peppercorns. So the way we're going to draw out the flavor and sort of the pepperiness of pepper is we're going to toast it first to help heat up and release those aromatics and those really flavorful oils that's in this spice first. So I'm going to take my skillet here that's already just, barely under medium heat and add in about a teaspoon of pepper. Now, when we go to prepare this dish, the pepper is really accentuated in this. So if you're not like a giant fan of the flavor of pepper, you can scale this back quite a bit. And I would say you can even do a 1/2 teaspoon, and that's going to yield itself to have like plenty of flavor. I'm a big fan of pepper, so I'm using actually a little bit more than a teaspoon. But if you don't like it, just adjust it as follows. Less can sometimes be more in this. So if you're not a huge fan, just use a little bit less. So I want to toast this for about, I would say 2 minutes or so. First, because we want to heat up the outer shell so that it kind of warms up the inside, and then we're going to grind it and heat it back up again. So as this is cooking on the skillet, I'm going to double check that my water is boiling and the salt is dissolved, which it looks like it is. And then I'm going to take this bucatini or spaghetti, both work. And there's a pasta noodle in there. I'm just going to set this in the water and then let go so that it spirals and kind of falls outward. And I'll let it sit in here just for a little bit. We want those noodles to warm up, and as they're heating up and cooking in there, they'll soften, and eventually with my spatula, I can sort of push them down so more of the noodles are submerged into the water. So some points so far to make with noodles is whenever you're cooking pasta, you always want to make sure you have like at least like 5 to 6 times the amount of water than you do pasta. And there's a reason for this. So the more surface area that the hot boiling water can have around a pasta noodle, the more evenly the noodle can cook. And this is important in terms of texture of the noodle. So if you've ever tried to make pasta for like a large group of people, one thing you probably have found is that just because it fits into the pot and the pasta does cook, ultimately when you go to like strain it or get it out of the pot, it sometimes kind of like congeals and sticks into its form, almost like a giant casserole of pasta. And though it's edible, it's not like fun, right? And so you want to have just like a decent amount of water to pasta. You want that ratio to be high so that the noodles cook evenly and you can truly detect an al dente texture. And so I would say that one of the most complicated parts about this specific dish, this cacio e pepe, is making sure that your noodles, when we go to add them to our skillet, because they're going to cook half in this water here and half in the skillet, we want them to be only 50% cooked when we make that transfer. So I want to be really mindful on making sure that my noodles are flexible, but they're a little bit stiff and it's not cooked all the way through, because we want to finish the cooking in our skillet. So I'm going to check the noodles here. It looks like they're starting to bend, which is good. That's what I want. I'm just pushing these little ends all the way down. Sometimes you can coax them. So one thing that will happen, and this is also an important aspect of this dish, is that as it's cooking in this salty, briny water, this will go down, some of the starch from the pasta is going to seep into the pasta water. And this is a good thing, because the starch from the pasta is going to be one of the variables that is going to emulsify our cheese and essentially make the sauce. So our sauce is made up of really just two things. It's going to be made up of cheese and starchy, salty pasta water. And with those combination of things, it's going to make everything really delicious and smooth. But if you were just to add in straight cheese and water, it wouldn't be as smooth and consistent had it not been cooked in the pasta. You need that starch in there. And so this is just a really simple, easy byproduct of that. So I'm gonna let it hang out and cook a little bit more. I'm realizing I need a ladle. Grab this quick, and I'm pretty sure these peppercorns are decently toasted. You'll start to notice that there's some aroma that comes from them. There's like a really fantastic smell going on. And so what I'm gonna do is grab another spatula and transfer these slightly toasted whole peppercorns into a mortar and pestle. Now, you don't have to have a mortar and pestle. This first step is slightly optional. You don't necessarily need to toast them twice, but I find that that flavor is really robust and fantastic. So I'm going to take this mortar and pestle here, and the first step is I'm just trying to break up. I wonder if I can show you. Can you guys see that okay? Maybe. So this is what we look like now. And then I'm just going to roll it on here. Sorry for the noise. I want to start to break open those heated peppercorns. And already, like, the perfume of the pepper is fantastic. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of pepper out there. There's white pepper. There's even like tricolor peppercorns, where some are sort of pink and orange and even yellowy colored. And if you like those flavor profiles, you can absolutely use it. I will say that in like a traditional cacio e pepe, it's the black pepper peppercorns that see a flavor. So what I'm looking for, if you happen to have a mortar and pestle, you can see I have a ton up here, is I want to see if there's any whole peppercorns, and I'm just sort of smushing them with this pestle here. And it doesn't need to be terribly fine. In fact, I like a little bit of chunk, but we just don't want a whole peppercorn in there. So what I'm doing is just spinning it around, and as the whole ones fall to the very center of the mortar, I'm just sort of crushing them with the pestle. If you've had a tough day, this is a really fantastic way to get out some of the angst of your day, and then you get pasta, which is just delicious. So we went from whole peppercorns, I don't know, can you see that okay? To
Give me just a second, Cole. I'm gonna put it on spotlight.
Cool.
There you go. Great. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, I had a question about the porter, mortar and pestle.
Yeah.
What would you use if you didn't have that?
So you could just use a regular pepper grinder. You could also use a coffee grinder or a coffee mill. And what you can do, this is where the optional part comes in. You don't necessarily need to toast the whole peppercorns first, but at some point, you need to toast the pepper. And so if you have, like, if you see these, like, this is just from Trader Joe's, like it's a cheap, like the whole peppercorns are in here. And so when I go to spin it, that's when I'm grinding them. So if you wanted to, you could just grind your freshly ground pepper into, you know, like the tablespoon, or sorry, the teaspoon or a half teaspoon, if you don't want as strong of a peppery taste into there. And then you would just toast it back on the skillet. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to transfer that ground pepper. I just really love the aromatics and the flavor that come from pre-toasting it. It's not the most necessary step, but I like doing that. But as long as you're able to freshly grind pepper, if you get something like this, I think this is $1.50, maybe $2. So it's relatively cheap. So I would say you can get one of these. If you have a coffee grinder, that also works, or a spice grinder. And you don't always need one of these cool gadgets, but I just think they look so fun. All right, so I'm gonna set that over here. Again, my skillet is on medium heat at this point, and I'm just going to waft some of this pepper around. I'm gonna check my pasta, I'm potentially at a crucial point. So it looks like I am. I'm gonna cut the heat because I don't want it to overcook, and remove it from that burner. And so this is about the time that I'm trying to notice how far is too far in the cooking of my pasta, because I don't want to go too much. I want to finish cooking it in here. So let's find out. This is a live show. You never know how it's going to go, especially with food. It's still pretty darn hard in the middle. So I'm actually, I would say even a little bit too hard. So I'm going to add it back to that heat. But as you saw, that noodle has some bend, like it's flexible in there. Yeah. So I want it like just barely hard in the center, but it's still a little bit too hard for me. So it's going back on. I'm going to add this off to the side. Give this a stir. All right. So right now, what is happening, because the pepper is freshly ground, and also because I preheated it, what you can't see on the screen or smell on the screen is the smell of the pepper right now. So it's been on here for just like what, a minute, and already it's incredibly perfumed in this kitchen in like a fabulous way. Like it's almost floral and spicy. It's delicious. So a chunk of that starch has seeped its way into the water, the salty, briny water. And what I'm going to do here, because I can smell the pepper and all those aromatics are starting to infuse out, I want to catch that and flavor some water. So what I'm going to do now is just take a single ladle of the pasta water and add it to that toasted pepper on the skillet. And you can see the steam coming up. That's normal and fine. And so you want to start one ladleful at a time. What will happen is a chunk of those really fine pepper particles that we ground, either from here or your mortar and pestle or your spice grinder, whatever you choose to use. It's going to pigment and color that water into sort of like a brownish amber color, but we're looking for something a bit more smoky. What I'm looking for color-wise is something kind of like caramel. And so a chunk that will just happen because of the small pepper particles, but essentially we're trying to infuse this starchy water with the pepper and the aromatics and some of those oils that are in the pepper. And then as it's cooking, a lot of that water is going to evaporate off. And we want that. We want it to evaporate off so that it becomes a little bit thinner. And as this is becoming thinner, we're going to start making sure that our pasta noodles are still good. So there's a timing situation going on here. One thing that I haven't done yet that I definitely need to start doing is grating some cheese. And the kind of cheese is important. The classic cheese that you use in a cacio e pepe is a pecorino. And pecorino is a sheep's cheese. It has sort of salty aspects to it. And I am using a microplane, which is also referred to as like a zester or a grater. And one of the keys to getting really good cacio e pepe is one, selecting high quality ingredients. So getting a thing of pecorino. You can get it pre-ground, that's totally fine. But I find that the flavor, if you do this yourself, is it's really fantastic because it is fresh, right? You're doing this yourself. And the other thing is you see these little like twills, how it's like really fine. It's different than like grated Parmesan, where they're almost granules. They're like these little twills, like little chocolate twills. But in this case, it's cheese. And the shape of the cheese is important so that as we go to mix this in, that's what creates the sauce. So you don't necessarily need a microplane, but any sort of grater will do. If you don't want to do any of that, if you go to any like regular old grocery store, you can get just already pre-grated pecorino. That also will be fine. I'm using pre-grated Parmesan a little bit in the recipe. And so if you wanted to, and you don't have to go all through this, you can get pre-grated pecorino, but I'm trying to be as authentic as possible. And I've had really good results with this method. So the amount of cheese that we're looking for is around, I would say 1 cup to 1.5 cups, not necessarily compacted, but just in terms of volume. And if you like cheese, and I really do, having more cheese involved isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm gonna check this and you turn up the heat. One thing I forgot to mention is when you do add the ladle full of water, you want to increase the heat. And I did not do that, so timing might be a little bit interesting. But I'm gonna do almost this entire block. Pecorino is a low moisture cheese, which means that it's a hard cheese. And because of that, it's a little bit tough to do. So you need a fairly sharp microplane or grater. And one thing I'm going to be mindful of, because it is so tough, just try not to get your fingers or like the base of your hand when you're going. You just want to be kind of careful. That's why I'm taking a little bit more time with this. I just got this microplane for Christmas and I really like it. But because it's like super fresh and new, it's really sharp. So I'm trying to be mindful. I don't want to get myself. And so as I'm getting closer to the tip, I'm going to start to back off just a little bit for the end of the rind, I should say. This is a good chunk of cheese. I really like pecorino. It's an aged cheese too, so there's some of those really fantastic crystals in there that have that awesome umami flavor. And in a good aged cheese, have you ever like bit into like an aged Gouda where it's almost like there's like this crunch in the inside of it? That is those crystals. I believe it's the cetirizine, or not cetirizine. Oh gosh, the amino acid is escaping me. But it's a specific kind of glutamine. No, it is. I think it's glutamine. Those crystals in there, and there's so much flavor. So I think I'm good with this. I'm also going to be adding in some Parmesan. Kind of is getting all over, and that's fine. Okay. So I'll show you here. That is all the cheese we're doing. And really that was just sort of, I would say like a decent chunk of a square, or not square, a triangle. Put this back in the bag, add it to the fridge. All right, I'm nervous about my pasta. Hope I didn't overcook it. A lot of this water from the pepper is starting to reduce. I like that, that's what I want. Let's check these noodles. That's pretty good. Okay. So they're a bit more done than I would like, but we're gonna survive and it's gonna be fine. So what I'm gonna do because of that, and this is actually a really good teaching moment, is normally you would add another ladle of water, and we are going to a little bit, but we're just not gonna add as much because the pasta is basically, it's very close to being done cooked wise. So instead of just pouring this into a colander and straining out that pasta water, we want to save it just in case we need to add a little bit of pasta water, because that's what's going to make our sauce. So I have noodles and place them in your peppery water. So step one. And then in an ideal world, and I think we're still going to do it, you'll add in just a little bit of pasta water after you've added in all your pasta. And we're going to finish cooking the noodles in the skillet with just that small amount of water. Takes a little bit of time. All right. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to take my spatula and just sort of whirl these noodles around. And I'm also going to add in, I would say, not an entire ladle because the noodles are a bit more done, just a little bit less. And then this is where the fun part comes in. So I'm going to add in about 1/4 of a cup at a time, just a small handful first of our pecorino cheese. So I'm sprinkling it around. You want to do really thin sprinkles because if you do it all at once in big clumps, essentially that cheese is going to melt, and but it's going to melt really localized in one spot. And so we don't want just like a single block of melty cheese. We want the cheese to be evenly dispersed throughout the pasta. So that starchy water is going to help emulsify the pasta, or the cheese, sorry, and also essentially make a little bit of a sauce. And the starchier the water, the better. So just a little bit at a time, making sure to regularly stir. And stirring is the important part. So we want that starch to come in contact with the cheese, and that's what's going to make the sauce. So if you just let it sit on top and melt, though it looks good and is pretty, we want a sauce to be made. We don't just want clumps of melted cheese. And I think that's where a chunk of people go wrong in the cacio e pepe, is they just let it melt, and then it's just sort of melted cheese in salty, starchy water. So you want to mix it really thoroughly before you add in the next handful. And the cheesier the sauce gets, and the more emulsified it becomes, the more delicious it is, and the more cheese you add after, the easier it is. I'm going to lower the heat just a little bit. It's kind of going crazy, but it is looking delicious. I actually need to add a little bit more pasta water, which is good. So it's definitely something that you kind of want to pay attention to. But the smell is just phenomenal. Like that floral and spicy scent from the pepper. And because it's a bucatini noodle, a lot of those cheeses and the flavor is going to physically cook and infuse into the noodle itself. I think that's so fun. All right, so we're gonna add in the last bit of this pecorino. So that was about 1.5 cups, roughly, just sort of eyeballed it. And again, I'm making sure to really mix in the cheese first because I want the water to come in contact with it. And this looks fabulous. Good. All right. I'm also going to add in a little bit of Parmesan cheese. And you can see that it just physically looks different. Like the granules of Parmesan, you can see that if you were to just do already like pre-grated pecorino, you might not be as successful in making the sauce. So that's why I wanted to do the pecorino first, and now I'm doing some Parmesan. I'm just eyeballing it, but I'm adding in about 1/4 of a cup, maybe a little bit more if you want more. All right, so what I'm looking for, the reason I keep going back with the ladle and the water is, of course, the water is evaporating off of it, but I also want a sauce that's being made, right? So if too much water evaporates, I won't, one, be able to emulsify the cheese that I'm adding in, and two, I want a sauce. So if everything evaporates, it's just gonna kind of get sticky, and we want to avoid that. All right, this looks really good. Okay, I do need to turn it up just a little bit, but I'm pretty happy with this whole mix. So we'll let that little amount of water evaporate. I see some little bits of cheese in here, and so I'm just trying to coax it and emulsify it along. But it looks really great. Cool. Now let that evaporate off just for a little bit. I'll close up this cheese here. And I will plate this with you guys so you can see a bit more clearly on how this should go. Okay, my crazy cutting board covered in cheese. Let me stir the pasta quick. Okay, this looks good. I'm gonna cut the heat and take it off. And can you guys see on your end, can you see the pasta a little bit here?
Yeah, could you pull it a little closer to the plate? Oh yeah, we can see it perfectly.
So you can see in some areas on here, do you see like there's a little clump of like melted cheese here, and there's some throughout. That's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but it takes a little bit of a knack and just mindfulness. You shouldn't stress over it. It's not like the largest deal in the world. I mean, who's going to complain about melted cheese? I don't think anyone. I won't. But we want this sauce to be made, and so I would say one of the next key important things to plating your cacio e pepe is you want to serve it relatively quickly after it's done being made. So like at this point, you have about, I would say, 5 to 7-ish minutes to get it to your guests or your loved ones or your mouth, because what's going to happen is the steam, the water in here is going to continue to evaporate off, which is totally fine. But the sauce that's made, what that then means is it's going to, instead of having this sort of like slight caramely, really ambery color to it, the noodles are going to stiffen up slightly, and it's going to get a little bit more, just, I would say, just stiff in general. And that's not bad. The flavor is still good, but if you're looking to have like just crazy, delicious, awesome flavor, you want to get this in your mouth as quick as possible. So the only other thing, this is just like a very fun, classic way to plate a pasta. And if you're using spaghetti or bucatini, this is such a fun little tool. We've used these for our souffle pancake class. It's those rubber silicone little circles. If you don't have that, you can use a cookie cutter, like a round cookie cutter. It's not a necessary thing, but it is nice to have. So I'll show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my large tongs here. Lift up some pasta, and then as I go to transfer it, I'm trying to put it in this little mold here on my plate, and I'm spinning the noodles as you go to set those down. And you don't necessarily want to pack them in, but just letting them gently sit on top. So you can see the little strings of cheese, how delicious. This might be a little bit too much. Actually, that totally is too much. I'm gonna do a little bit less. So aiming to get it in that mold here, you can coax it with your hands. And I'm spinning the plate because we're looking to achieve not like perfect spirals, but like cute little spirals would be just the most idyllic thing ever. And as they're sitting in here, I'm gonna let them hang out for just a hot second. Oh man, that flavor is so good. And then you're just gonna wiggle it a little bit. And you have this like cute little blob of perfect pasta. I mean, how adorable and amazing is that? Isn't that fun? So that's our first dish, the cacio e pepe, and I'm gonna treat myself to a bite quick. If you got the time and you want to get the ingredients, I highly recommend this. It is delicious. It's so good. It's crazy simple. It's gonna be a hit. So that is recipe menu item number 1, super delicious. Our next one is just a simple bruschetta, nothing too crazy. All you need is a baguette. Baguette, there's baguette, French baguette. I would say any baguette is gonna be just fine. I'm gonna grab a serrated knife. And I find that cutting these along an angle is really good. So what I'm gonna do here is try to just eyeball roughly. I'm gonna do an initial cut, and what I'm looking for is about 3/4 inch wide thickness here. And I'm doing it at about a 45-degree angle, making sure my blade is vertical, not like slightly tilted side to side, but we want really straight cuts. And essentially what we're doing here is making a crostini, which translates in Italian into little toasts. And I think that is the most adorable thing in the world. And because it's just me today, I have all this pasta, so I don't need tons of bread. I'm just gonna do 3 little slices here. Set this one off to the side too. And I have here just a sheet tray that I've lined with parchment paper. Go ahead and just set your sliced baguette on there. And then I'll just do a drizzle of olive oil. There's lots of different kinds of olive oil, but because this is like very much an Italian day, if you find a cold pressed and unfiltered extra virgin olive oil, the flavor in here is gonna be just like remarkable. So yummy. I love that. So I'm just smeared a little bit of oil on top because we want these to crisp up a little bit. That's delicious. And so again, my oven is preheated to 375. And really all I'm looking for is to see if these can toast up just a little bit, because even if they're not completely like have those toasty marks on the outside of the edge of the bread, that's fine because they're going to continue to firm up and cook even when we take them out a little bit. So really, I'm just going to put these in for about 3 minutes or so. I have a timer because otherwise I would forget it. And now we just get to make our filling for the bruschetta. And this also could not be simpler. So I'm using 2 kinds of tomatoes. I have adorable little garden tomatoes here. I think we'll start with those. I have this guy right here. And so I've already washed these and given them a loose rinse. But what I'm gonna do is I'll quarter the tomatoes from like where the head of the stem was on top. I'm going to go straight down from that spot. And then I'm also going to lay them down and then quarter them again. And I'm just gonna do a small amount because again, it's just me today. And the reason we're going from the top, like vertical with our cuts in proximity to the tomato is similar to a pico de gallo. We want to get rid a chunk of the moisture in here. So I'm trying to remove some of the seeds and the liquid that's in these garden tomatoes. Because if it's too watery, that liquid is just going to sort of run all over your bruschetta, and we want to avoid that. So you can use your fingers. Some people like using just like the end of a spoon. Both work. I feel like using a spoon isn't as effective in my opinion, but honestly, like whatever works for you, it's gonna be just fine. Because we don't want a soup. We want kind of like a fairly hearty, thick dip. Also, I guess not all tomato seeds are this way, but most tomato seeds, if you get a lot of them, they're kind of bitter. They don't always taste the best. Though the liquid of a tomato tastes delicious, there's a little bit of a bitterness to the seeds. So you want this to be more on the chunky end than on the runny end. So I'm getting those out. I'm gonna give these another little chop because these chunks are still pretty darn big. And I'll add those to a bowl. Cool. So we have just sort of like a classic tomato. I was almost thinking about holding off on this recipe because I want to do like a fun tomato dish for when tomatoes are in season in the summer. And this year is the first year that we're growing tomatoes in our garden, and we're going to do cherry tomatoes. I'm very excited. I hope they turn out okay. So we'll have to do something special, maybe a different kind of bruschetta. So we have just a few garden tomatoes here, and then there's the timer. Hands are covered in tomato. 1 second. I'm gonna give these crostinis a check. They look right. I think that might have been just the perfect amount of time. Let me transfer. Let me use this hot pad here on this end. And as these are cooling down so I can handle them, I'll finish up the bruschetta. So we have here those cordon garden tomatoes, and I'm just gonna add a few more cherry tomatoes. One, and this is true for most things, whenever you have like a smaller miniaturized version of a fruit, oftentimes they are sweeter in flavor, and it's not always. The only, sometimes what happens, which is different for peppers, is the smaller and cuter the pepper or the chili is that you're using, the hotter it is. But with these fun little small heirloom tomatoes, I'm gonna add in some variety. I'm looking for color too, because if you eat the rainbow, which is what they told us in dietetics school, when you get lots of variety of color in your produce and in your diet, as long as it's not artificial, you're getting all sorts of different kinds of nutrition. There's polyphenols and flavonoids and different flavor compounds in here. That's just like delicious, nutritious, super yummy. So I'm looking for yellow ones, orange ones, one of these green ones here. Cool. And I'm happy with that. So you can see some of those seeds have fallen out. That's totally fine. But now it's not super watery. It's perfect. So I'm also going to add to this a basil leaf that I'm going to chiffonade, which basically just means to ribbon to make really fine cuts. And because I'm doing just a Kole size portion, I'm going to just do one basil leaf and really thinly run my knife across it. Add that to my bruschetta. Now, where some people go wrong with this is people start to salt this mixture right here. And the one reason we want to avoid that is salt, like we talked about before, has a tendency to draw out moisture. And we don't necessarily want more liquid drawn out of this. We want it to stay intact into the tomato. We don't want the tomatoes to seep out all those juices. We want them to stay remotely saturated and whole. So I'm not going to add salt to this. If you wanted to, you could add a crack of pepper, but I think each person has sort of different thoughts on the amount of pepper that they like. And so rather than that, I think if you do a crack of pepper over the top last, that's much more appropriate. And so the only other step that you can do, and this is optional, but I think it's a lot of fun. I really like spicy things. And so I'm going to use another Italian ingredient. This is a Calabrian pepper, and it's just a jar of them. And Calabrian peppers are kind of a unique flavor. So there is some heat there. They are kind of spicy, but that's fantastic. It's also very similar to physical pepper in that there are these floral and also kind of like spicy, smoky notes to it. And I think that works really well because basil is historically sort of like cooling and calming. And then you have this really fantastic flavor from the Calabrian pepper. And then just the other tomatoes in here, it's just delicious. So that's really the only other thing we're going to add to it. And then this last step, it's not necessarily necessary, but I do think it's a lot of fun. So we've used this tool before. I think the last time we used this might have been the ramen class or some other sort of Eastern class. But this is essentially, I'll show you actually here. There are these little nubs on this plate, and there's just these little things that come up and they sort of they're slightly pokey. And so what's fun about this, I often use it whenever I'm cooking or making stuff with ginger. Ginger is really woody and sort of rough. And if you want to add in ginger paste that's not like that strange preserved stuff at the grocery store, you can make a fresh ginger paste at home with this little tool. I forget what it's called, but I can also send that in a follow-up email. But the little nubs on it are also great if you want to make a paste really from anything, from garlic, from ginger, and it's the perfect consistency. So if you want to, you could just regularly mince some garlic, and I think that's fine. The classic Italian way to make a bruschetta is you actually just like cut a clove of garlic and just physically rub it on the bread. And that methodology, totally fine, literally nothing wrong with it. But for me, I am an extra kind of a person, I'm finding. And this is just a really fun way to add in a chunk of flavor. So I'm just doing these small little circles, and you can already see, like, I don't even need this whole clove, that's sort of silly. You have like perfectly made, is that on like the screen? There we go. Perfectly made garlic paste. Like that's so easy and simple. So you can just smear it on with a finger or a spatula, the back of a spoon, it doesn't matter. Because this is raw garlic, a little bit goes a long way. You don't need a lot in this. So I'll just do a small smear because it's just me. I'm fine with using my finger. And there's still some oil on there. Fabulous. Cool. Gosh, that's that we do need is just a little bit of olive oil to our bruschetta mix that has that Calabrian chili. And I'm just eyeballing it. And I think you should too. In the recipe, I think I put in like a total of maybe 5 tablespoons if you do like a large version of this bruschetta, because I find that it's very popular at get-togethers. And so what I'll do is just do a small spoonful on our crostinis that we've made. I can see some of those Calabrian chilies just sitting in the beds of those garden tomatoes. It is just so beautiful. So I'll plate these up a little bit better and set them in front of here. So the last step is optional, but I'm going to do just a crack of pepper. And I'm going to use a finishing salt. And we've talked about this before, I think, in the past, but it's often referred to as flaky salt. So we're using 2 different kinds of salt today. We're using coarse salt, which is, like we talked about, the least salty salt. It physically, because it's larger, it takes up more space, but it's also sort of hollow on the inside. But this salt is sort of flat, and it's a finishing salt, one, because it looks so cool. A lot of times when you go to restaurants, this is what they'll like put at the very end on a dish. And I'll show you, I can't, hope they don't spill it. Can you see some of those granules on there?
Oh yeah, wow, Cole.
Isn't that fun?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot, I mean, what's great about Italian food is, it really is simple ingredients, like there wasn't a whole lot of ingredients for this pasta, for this. I mean, most of the stuff you have on hand anyway. But when you use ingredients mindfully and with intention, like Italians have forever, you take simple things and you can really do and honor them in dishes and like this that are just fantastic. It's not a whole lot of effort, and it's so delicious that I think it's really worth it. So that's our class today. The mold has that we used, that circular thing, this pasta has sort of fallen out of it. I think it needed to sit in there just slightly longer to keep the shape, but I don't think anyone's going to complain on this. You can see though too that it's gotten a little bit more opaque and transparent. Some of that creaminess that was there has evaporated off because that pasta is still warm. And so you really do kind of want to serve it within that 5-minute range. But that's today's class. This is our cacio e pepe and just an easy bruschetta. And yeah, I'm really proud of this. I hope you give it a try and let me know what you think.
Mwah. Looks
Mwah.
beautiful, Cole.
Thank you.
All right. I'm just gonna leave the comments up for a few minutes or a bit here so that people, if they want to say anything, we did get Cole. Pat Warner wanted to say her Italian grandmother had a comment. Pasta doesn't wait for people. The people must wait for the pasta.
I love that. That is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. And we do have a request. If you would be interested in doing a class on microgreens.
Microgreens. Yeah. I might wait a little bit to where not like there's a season for them, but there's lots of varieties now that spring is coming, where farmers markets have lots of different kinds of microgreens. So if I can support local, I'd love to do that too. So that would be a super fun class. I would just want to wait a little bit to do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Up to you. All right. And then just a lot of accolades for your fun classes and your great recipes. So as you all know, they will be sent out to you after the class. It's, I think, 1 day and 1 hour after the class ends, all attendees will receive the ingredient list again with the recipe included. All right. Well, I think that rolls it up for us. Yep. So thanks, Cole. I hope you have a great Saturday. I heard it's beautiful outside. So yeah, and hope you all get to enjoy it.
You as well. Thanks for coming, guys.
All right. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.